So we're going to go over an article today in the Prospect by Ian Dunt. And for those of you who may remember that name, I think at this moment in time, he is one of the biggest people who is, well, I'd say one of the probably most accurately reporting on the troubles and dangers of during and post-Brexit. In fact, I cannot recommend highly his book, Brexit, What the Hell Happens Now. It is probably the best book to, well, describe what the hell's going on. And he's written an amazing article in his Prospect, and it's called The Most Important Brexit Detail You've Never Heard Of. And many of you, if you've seen some of my videos before, you will know we've gone over before the World Trade Organization's rule, the Most Favoured Nation rule. Now, Brexiteers very, very rarely mention this, but this is what will make huge and cause huge trouble for us if we end up sliding to WTO rules. So, let's just go over this article, because again, it's fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. So, whenever the imagined life outside the European Union, Brexiteers often speak dreamily about the Most Favoured Nation rule. It sounds a privileged and gold-plated, like lucrative lounge at the airport. In reality, it is nothing of the sort. This is what it really means, and why it makes Brexit such a dangerous endeavour. Most Favoured Nation is a World Trade Organization rule that says you cannot discriminate in your tariff arrangements outside of a free trade agreement. If you want to have tariffs of 10% for oranges from Brazil, then you have to have them at the same level for the United States. Essentially, it bans favoritism. It should not be called, it should really be called, no Most Favoured Nation. The only way out of this straitjacket is to sign a formal trade agreement, either with another country or a group of other countries, the European Economic Area, for example, which the UK is currently a signatory to. It is one such agreement. The EU also has a more traditional agreements with other states like Canada, South Korea, and will probably have one soon with Japan. Once two partners have got a free trade agreement, they can adopt whatever tariffs towards each other they like, or even eliminate them altogether. They can do that without even having to reciprocate them for everyone else. It's like creating a firewall around your trade agreement. Some trade deals also have a Most Favoured Nation clause in them. This is another anti-discrimination initiative. It promises your partner that if you sign another trade deal with someone else on better terms, this one will be upgraded to meet it. It's the bilateral trade equivalent of the John Lewis Price promise. Far from being an executive lounge advantage for Brexiteers, the Most Favoured Nation is actually a massive problem for them. For a start, if the EU offers a deal to the UK which is better than agreed with South Korea and Canada, it has to find a way out of its Most Favoured Nation clause with those countries. So as you can see, they are not going to break that. Particularly how long it spent actually making these trade deals. It spent, I think the Canadian one took about 8 years to actually do, and then another 2 years to actually ratify in both parliaments. That is a problem which lawyers are going to make lots of money out of. It could even, in the worst case scenario, discourage the EU from offering the UK a better deal at all. But the bigger issue comes if there is no deal, which, by the way, is a very real possibility. Remember, we have to somehow go through 300 different laws and regulations when it took us almost a year and a half to go through 3. And that was the Northern Irish border, EU citizens' rights, the divorce bill, and I can't remember what the other one is. But bear in mind, the citizens' rights and the Irish border question are still up in the air. Those questions have still not been answered. So those will resurface again this year, I guarantee you. And bear in mind, David Davis has said repeatedly, oh yeah, we can do a no deal. And then when the EU went, okay, we'll put all this money aside for a no deal if it happens, he went, oh no, I didn't mean that. So they called his bluff, and bear in mind, in not the last budget, but the one before, we set aside a load of money for specifically a no-deal scenario. That money got wiped out, which no one talks about, by the way. So, and last budget as well, there was another set aside for another no-deal scenario. So, yeah, this is a, make no mistake, a no deal is a very real possibility. So anyway, he continues. So if there is a no deal, our tariffs with Europe are currently 0 on everything. Because we're in the same customs union, Brexiteers even insist if we fail to get a deal with Brussels, we can unilaterally decide to keep our tariffs where they are and demand that they do the same. But most favoured nations means that the repercussions of this would be very severe, as we would have to eradicate all our tariffs with every country on earth, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. Insane as it sounds, some Brexiteers like the sound of this. Daniel Hannan, this is the free trade fanatic, the Tory MEP whose think tank has been warmly welcomed into Whitehall by Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, is a leading proponent of this idea. This type of Brexiteer typically believes in unilateral tariff reduction as a kind of Viagra capitalism, unleashing a potential new Britain onto the world stage. In reality, it would be rather different. The first thing that would happen is that British agriculture would be devastated. Cheap food would flood in from around the world, leaving domestic producers unable to compete. Some of them might be able to carve out a niche in the upper end of the market by focusing on quality. Others would diversify, but most would struggle under these new standards, especially after the European subsidies dry up and tariff walls went up against their exports. Similar things would happen, but to a lesser but very meaningful extent in manufacturing. So, some free marketeers say that this is all part of the regrettable but necessary process of capitalist renewal. The truth is, these producers aren't globally competitive. Those farmers will just have to retain their digital consultants or something. The consumer, meanwhile, will be getting a cheaper product. The reality is far more complicated. Countries like Brazil and Thailand heavily subsidise much of their agriculture. They subsidise sugar, for instance. If they start dumping it in the UK, there is no way for a domestically produced British sugar to compete. But that's not the free market. It's the British government's failure to protect its domestic industries from the effects of foreign government subsidies. British producers would be up against the wall. While cheap foreign goods and food flooded the market, they would be unable to export their own produce because no reciprocal tariff will exist. Everyone else's barriers would still be up. We'd be the only ones smashing smashing ours to pieces. This is the remorseless logic of the most favoured nation. It is the chief reason why a deal with Europe is paramount. If it is not secured, Britain faces either closing itself off from its largest market or opening itself up to everyone else, and neither option is particularly attractive. So, as you can see, no one talks about this, and this is so infuriating on so many levels, because this is one of the things that should have been talked about, because a lot of Brexiteers are massively in favour of protecting British industry. In fact, much of the arguments some of them made was that we need to leave the single market because then we can protect our own industry. People like Daniel Hannan, by the way, and Rees-Mogg was also in favour of this. This would not protect British industry at all if this happened, and what they want. This, Viagra capitalism, where literally the UK is flooded with, as has been mentioned, cheap food and other cheap manufacturing goods. The UK, manufacturing base, its agricultural base, would just not be able to compete. It would be wiped out almost within 5 years because they just could not compete. And that's the situation where we are in. And this is an incredible warning sign, because a lot of Brexiteers voted specifically for this dumbass reason that somehow the European single market is a bad idea and it hurts British businesses and manufacturing. But, damn be the logic. And, when, as I've said many times before, this year is the year it's going to all kick off. March is when it's going to start. Like I say, at the moment, you've probably heard nothing. But March is when it's all going to kick off. And, given the two impact studies that have been commissioned by the Scottish Parliament and by Sadiq Khan for London, both focusing on those areas and that region, it makes David Davis look like an absolute tit, but that's not hard to do. So, please, people, think about it for just 1 second and think, what about, what I've just been talking about? Is that really what you want to happen to the UK? Because from a lot of what the rhetoric that was made about Brexit, that's not what you want. But apparently that is what you're going to get.